The Tiger King's fraudulent conveyance means Carole Baskin now owns the property. What? Netflix star Joseph Maldonado-Passage, aka Joe Exotic, also known as the Tiger King, suffered a big setback this week when an Oklahoma federal judge determined that he had fraudulently conveyed his property to avoid Carole Baskin taking everything over. As anyone who watched The Tiger King knows, Carole Baskin is Joe Exotic's arch enemy, and she's the owner of Big Cat Rescue based out of Florida. Way back in 2013, Carole Baskin and Big Cat Rescue were awarded a trademark infringement judgment of $1 million against the Tiger King, Joe Exotic. This is where the fraudulent transfer comes in. After that $1 million judgment, Joe Exotic then transferred the deeds to his property and to other various properties to his mother and to the holding company that owned and operated the park. The quitclaim deeds that transferred the real property were recorded in September of 2015 and February of 2016, which is obviously after 2013, and the $1 million judgment had not been paid. So what's going on here is that Joe Exotic is a judgment debtor. He owes $1 million to Big Cat Rescue, and he's taking the property that he should use to fulfill that judgment, and he's transferring it to someone else. And so that is what the law will not allow as a fraudulent transfer. If there is a fraudulent transfer, then the court will void it and act as if it never happened. In a summary judgment order, the Oklahoma judge did conclude that the Tiger King, Joe Exotic, had fraudulently conveyed the property to his mother and to the LLC, and they voided the transfers, and as a result, the property now is going to go to Carole Baskin and Big Cat Rescue. From a legal standpoint, this issue really underscores the importance of the Fraudulent Conveyance Act, also known as the Fraudulent Transfer Act in many states. Almost all states have passed the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, so even though it's slightly different in different states and it's codified in different areas, pretty much every state has the same law. The intent is fraudulent if there's actual intent to delay, hinder, or defraud any creditor of the debtor. So how do you decide actual intent? That sounds pretty subjective. Well, conveniently, there's an 11-factor test that we can look at. Those factors include
whether the transfer or obligation was to an insider. It's bad if it is. Whether the debtor retained possession or control of the property transferred after the transfer. That's another factor that doesn't look great. Whether the transfer or obligation was disclosed or concealed. Better to disclose it than conceal it. Whether before the transfer was made or the obligation was incurred, the debtor had been sued or threatened with a suit. That's a big one. Whether the transfer was of substantially all of the assets of the debtor. So did the debtor keep any of the assets or pretty much give up all of their stuff? Whether the debtor absconded. That's bad to do. Whether the debtor removed or concealed assets. Whether the value of the consideration, the amount that was paid by the debtor, was reasonably equivalent to the value of the assets. That's a huge one. So it's got to look fair. You got to have fair consideration. Whether the debtor was insolvent or became insolvent shortly after. Whether the transfer occurred shortly before or after there was substantial debt incurred. It's bad if it was. And whether the debtor transferred the essential assets of the business to a lien holder who then transferred to an insider.
If you don't already have a claim against you, it's possible to structure a transaction in such a way that it follows the Fraudulent Transfer Act, so you don't have to worry about it being a fraudulent transfer. You can make sure that your transfer is not a fraudulent transfer. I will point out that if you already have a judgment against you, it's pretty much impossible to avoid a fraudulent transfer. At that point, once you have a judgment against you, anything that you transfer, they're going to have a strong argument that you did that with an intent to avoid having to pay the judgment. And as anyone who's watched Tiger King knows, that's what Joe Exotic was doing here to avoid the judgment. In that case, the Fraudulent Transfer Act is doing its job, and we should all be happy with this outcome, even No matter what side of the Tiger King, Joe Exotic versus Carole Baskin fence you stand on. And no matter what you think about whether or not Carole killed her husband, which I do not care to comment on. Have a great day.